The biggest drug dealer in history? Not Pablo Escobar, not the Sicilian Mafia. It was the British Crown. The empire on which the sun never set ran the largest narcotics operation in history for half a century. And the best customer turned out to be a state that considered itself the center of the world, the Qing Empire. 400 million people, thousands of years of tradition, a civilization proud and closed. A few crates of opium, a few steamships, 20,000 soldiers. That's all it took for a kingdom that seemed eternal as heaven to crumble like porcelain. At the beginning of the 19th century, China under the Qing dynasty remained deliberately isolated from the West. You're standing in Canton, the only place in the entire empire where foreigners can trade. The Canton system, introduced in 1757, concentrated all foreign trade in this southern port. It was the empire's way of controlling contact with barbarian merchants. You watch European traders locked in their factory district like animals in cages, except they're paying for the privilege of being behind bars. They're forbidden from venturing into the interior, can't bring their families. Foreign women are especially prohibited from settling, because who could predict what gossip they bring into our homes and gardens? Everything must go through licensed merchants from the Kohong Guild. It resembles today's exclusive clubs, entry only by recommendation and after meeting strict conditions. In the mentality of the mandarins, to which you belong, China is the center of the world. You're a product of the examination system, which turned men into either geniuses or madmen. Every year, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of candidates sat for the exams, but only 1% passed. It's like today's competition for Harvard, except it lasted a lifetime and ended in either a glittering career or madness from overwork. You spent years cramming Confucian classics while the world outside your window changed. You consider yourself the embodiment of Confucian virtues, yet you have no idea how a steamship works. And this was one of the greatest paradoxes of the era. The most educated people in the world were completely unprepared to meet modernity. You remember Emperor Qianlong's famous letter to the King of England. Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance within its own borders and lacks no product. Therefore, we have no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians. Chinese authorities viewed trade with Europeans not as an equal exchange, but as the emperor's grace. For the privilege of trade, foreigners must strictly submit to local regulations and show humility toward representatives of the Qing dynasty. The proof was to be the kowtow ceremony, full prostrations before the emperor during diplomatic missions. Watching these red barbarians in their ridiculous uniforms, you're convinced the rest of the world has nothing of value to offer the Middle Kingdom. Your world seems unchanging and eternal. The empire, in your conviction, rules over all races of the world, surrounding them with protection from the heights of its culture. In this atmosphere of isolation and self-satisfaction at court and in the Qing administration, the conviction solidified that China is an eternal, unchanging center, a perfect civilization. But on the horizon of this seemingly self-sufficient empire, a factor appears that will shake its foundations. The sweet poison. In the second decade of the 19th century, something disturbing creeps into your ordered world. The British, hungry for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, struggle with a growing trade deficit. The empire demands payment exclusively in silver, refusing to allow the import of British goods. European silver flows in streams to the Middle Kingdom. The solution turns out to be a drug produced in British India: opium. In the early 1820s, the East India Company develops poppy cultivation in Bengal on a massive scale. Initially, it reaches China illegally, through smugglers, and later more boldly, under the eye of British trade agents. You observe strange boats appearing in the ports. British and American smugglers moor vessels full of contraband off China's coast. It's like today's dark corners of the internet, only in an 18th century version. Chinese traders collect the goods in small boats and distribute them through a dense network of waterways. Around 1830, over 100 Chinese smuggling boats already operate. An entire fleet of drug dealers, who probably called themselves import businessmen. The result of this flood of supply is both dramatic and absurd. Opium imports grow from about 4,500 chests to 40,000 chests annually. Each chest weighs about 60 kilograms. Imagine thousands of tons of narcotics flowing into a country whose authorities theoretically ban it every year. It's trying to stop a tsunami with a sieve. But the real absurdity is just beginning. Opium dens spring up in port cities where you can meet everyone, from beggars to imperial officials. It's the true melting pot of that era. Except instead of integration, it brings shared addiction. In more refined forms, smoking is accompanied by listening to poetry and sexual relations with courtesans. One participant described, "Every day, Yulin painted herself and demanded 1 liang of silver when she saw a client. She took a Hunan speckled bamboo pipe and lay down with the man. She scooped the paste and lit the lamp. She lived from this business." For the poor, opium becomes an escape from suffering. At the very bottom of the social ladder are port dives for the poorest. Coolies, stevedores, port workers, fishermen create an entirely different world of opium. There are no silk cushions here, only straw mats. Instead of silver lamps, ordinary clay oil lamps. But the need to escape reality is the same. These men come to the dens between shifts, during a brief break from grueling physical labor. For them, opium isn't entertainment. It's medicine for an aching back after 14 hours of hauling, for rope-burned hands, for insomnia from chronic exhaustion. One such laborer might say, "After a whole day loading ships, my hands shake so much I can't hold chopsticks. A few puffs and I can go home again, pretend to my wife that everything's fine." Emperor Daoguang receives increasingly disturbing reports. Soldiers and officials succumb to opium smoking, undermining military discipline and administrative efficiency. Garrisons where soldiers addictively use smoke lose combat value. Desertions and disintegration appear. The phenomenon has serious economic consequences too. Silver, which for previous centuries flowed from Europe to China in exchange for tea and luxury goods, now begins streaming out of China to pay for illegal opium deliveries. In the early 1820s, annual silver outflow from the Middle Kingdom amounts to about 2 million ounces. But 10 years later, it reaches 9 or even 10 million ounces. Chinese currency, silver taels, becomes increasingly difficult to obtain. Silver's value rises, causing price inflation and tax disturbances. You, as a provincial official, report to the capital that precious metals are disappearing from the province. Peasants have difficulty paying taxes in silver, and the imperial treasury records an alarming drop in reserves. By the late 1830s, it's estimated that the number of addicted Chinese reaches 4 to 12 million people. Vast swaths of society, from the poor to the elites, fall into addiction. It's estimated that by mid-century, about 2 million inhabitants of the Middle Kingdom were addicted to this poison. The drug weakens not only the health of society, but the financial foundations of the Qing dynasty. The system crumbles. As opium spreads across the country, internal administrative decay becomes increasingly difficult to hide. Many local officials profit from contraband. Emperor Daoguang wrote that officials taking bribes from opium smugglers are traitors to the nation. Despite imperial edicts prohibiting trade since the beginning of the century, corruption flourishes at every level in practice. Border guards and patrol flotillas often turn a blind eye to the revelries of smoke boats, naturally for a handsome fee. British merchants encourage this practice. They massively bribe officials, distribute free opium samples to addict new customers, and organize entire smuggling networks in cooperation with Chinese criminals. Instead of fighting contraband, part of the Qing authorities' representatives become its silent accomplices. You, as a conscientious official, try to enforce the law, but encounter resistance and falsified statistics. Local mandarins fear reporting the full truth about the scale of addiction and smuggling to Beijing. They fear the throne's anger, shame, and punishment for their own negligence. In many provinces, the problem is swept under the rug. Confiscation numbers are understated. The number of addicts in reports is marginalized, and the apparatus's failure in the field is masked with fictitious successes. The state loses its bones. The administrative backbone crumbles, devoured by fear, corruption, and impotence. Your honest reports about thousands of opium pipes in the area and bribed port guards are ignored by superiors. Nobody wants to hear bad news. The atmosphere among officials resembles a game of blind man's bluff, where everyone pretends not to see the obvious problem. Everyone knows the scale of the opium plague, but officially few have the courage to admit it. It resembles the imperial version of an elephant in the room. Everyone sees the huge opium elephant, but pretends it's just some larger rat. Those who remain loyal to the imperial ban feel like dam keepers whose dam cracked long ago. The emperor issues decisive orders, but local structures are paralyzed by corruption. Spectacular actions occur. A newly appointed governor organizes show raids on opium dens, confiscates hundreds of pipes, and publicly punishes the guilty. It's like trying to extinguish a forest fire with a glass of water. Impressive, but ineffective. In ports, warehouses of confiscated opium regularly explode, apparently even as evidence. The drug has self-destructive tendencies. After such incidents, there remain ashes and compromised officials who must explain to superiors why their secured opium suddenly vanished in smoke. Rumors claim that even in the capital, a certain prince from the imperial family addictively smokes opium. Nothing undermines the dynasty's prestige like news that the sons of heaven use the same drug as street beggars. In 1838, Emperor Daoguang, impatient with contradictory reports, convenes a special council. Some advisors suggest legalizing opium and imposing a tax on it, which would fill the treasury. They point out that a state monopoly, similar to the salt monopoly, could bring financial benefits. However, the outraged moralist faction, among them you, argues this won't solve the social catastrophe. Finally, the hard line prevails. The emperor decides to completely eliminate drug trade and severely punish the guilty to save the nation from degeneration. To carry out the mission, he appoints a man whose name will go down in history: Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu's crusade. In 1839, a special imperial envoy arrives in Canton. Commissioner Lin Zexu, endowed with extraordinary powers to crush opium trade once and for all. Lin was an outstanding scholarly official and a man of impeccable reputation, known for honesty, diligence, and fervent patriotism. Exceptionally capable, he passed the highest state examination with a magnificent result, receiving the Jinshi degree, comparable to a doctorate in European education. He was employed at the famous Hanlin Academy, the most prestigious educational institution in China. He gained a reputation as an incorruptible and righteous official, which distinguished him against the background of a corrupt environment. You, as a lower-ranking official assigned to his commission, observe Lin Zexu with admiration and anxiety. He traveled to Canton for 2 months from Beijing with a modest retinue. Only 1 secretary, 6 guards, and 3 cooks who constantly remained with him, preventing any opportunities to exploit local hostesses along the way. This minimalist approach reflected his unwavering commitment to virtue. Commissioner Lin begins by cleaning his own backyard. He orders mass raids on Chinese opium dens in Canton. Within a few months, he arrests over 1,700 dealers and confiscates over 70,000 opium pipes. He severely punishes local dealers. Many are sentenced to flogging, exile, and the most hardened dealers receive death sentences. These internal actions, however, cannot solve the problem while new deliveries continue arriving by sea. Lin orders foreign merchants to hand over opium stocks to Chinese officials and sign a document pledging not to sell the drug under threat of losing the right to legal trade in all goods. Foreign merchants, mainly British, find themselves trapped. In response to the Chinese side's demand, they hand over only 1,037 chests of opium, merely a fraction of accumulated stocks, which they hastily transfer to ships. Lin Zexu, however, isn't bluffing. When the British try to hand over only a symbolic amount, the commissioner orders the foreign factory district blocked and cuts off all Chinese food supplies and services. For 47 days, the impasse lasts. The British are imprisoned in their warehouses in Canton, deprived of provisions. Finally, seeing Lin's determination, they yield to pressure and release all accumulated drugs. About 20,000 chests, containing in total over 3 million pounds, or about 1,350,000 kilograms of opium. This cargo was formally first handed over to British Superintendent Charles Elliot, who, to save face, gave it into Commissioner Lin's hands as property of the British government, forced to release it. On June 3, 1839, Lin Zexu organizes a great public destruction of opium on Humen Beach at the mouth of the Pearl River. For 23 days, Chinese laborers, under official supervision, destroy the confiscated drug. They mix it with lime and salt in huge pits flooded with seawater, then flush the toxic remains into the estuary. You stand beside Lin Zexu as he oversees the procedure, and you see determination, but also the weight of worries on his face. The commissioner composes an elegy, apologizing to the sea gods for polluting their kingdom. He writes later, "If heaven must punish us for destroying poison, let it punish only me, not the innocent people." Aware that his act might bring British wrath, even before destroying the opium, Lin attempts to diplomatically defuse the crisis. In August of the same year, he issues a famous open letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of justice. He asks rhetorically, "We have heard that in your country opium is prohibited with the greatest severity. This is proof that you know perfectly well how harmful this drug is. Since you do not allow it to harm your own nation, why would you allow it to poison another, especially China?" Lin points out British hypocrisy. Has China ever exported to your country anything that harms people? Our tea, rhubarb, silk, all serve your health and benefit, and you send us poison that destroys our people. He admonishes the Queen that if roles were reversed and Chinese flooded England with opium, her government would certainly react with anger. Unfortunately, this letter never reached Victoria's hands directly. It was probably stopped by colonial bureaucracy along the way. It was indeed published in the press and appeared in the Times in London, sparking brief public debate. But it didn't influence Her Majesty's government policy. the British had no intention of giving up the lucrative opium trade. Lin Zexu achieves partial success. In a short time, trade in Canton ceases, but the British response comes. In the summer of 1839, an incident occurs. Drunk British sailors kill a Chinese villager, the Lin Zexu affair in Kowloon. When the commissioner demands the guilty be handed over to Chinese court, the British refuse, protecting their citizens from what they consider draconian Qing justice. Tension grows. British authorities, treating the opium confiscation as an affront and financial loss, decide to use force. Lin Zexu, though acting with the emperor's will, writes in his diary that he feels desperation, as if standing on the edge of an abyss. He knows that if Britain throws down an armed challenge, the Middle Kingdom will face its hardest test. When dragons meet steamships. In 1840, a British expeditionary fleet approaches China's southern coast, looking to the Chinese like mythical steam dragons. These are modern warships, powerful frigates and artillery sloops, and a technological novelty, the steam vessel Nemesis, the first iron steamship armed with Congreve rockets and heavy cannons. For the first time, you see vessels moving without sails, spewing clouds of smoke and sailing against the wind, independent of weather whims. On British decks are elite Marines and soldiers experienced in Napoleonic battles, armed with modern percussion cap rifles and excellent long-range cannons. They're accompanied by detachments of Hindu sepoys from the East India Company's army. In total, invasion forces number several thousand men. On paper, little against the Qing's million-man army, but the qualitative advantage is crushingly on the British side. The Chinese fleet and coastal defense appear archaic by comparison. Local commanders mainly have wooden junks and some old sailing ships, armed with cast-iron cannons, sometimes remembering times of past centuries. Gunpowder is often poor quality, and artillerymen's training very weak. Reports show that many Chinese cannons are rusted and poorly calibrated. They sometimes crack at the first shot. The land army in Canton consists mainly of militia and Green Standard garrison units, demoralized and unprepared to fight Europeans. Worse still, there's no coherent defense plan. Local commanders don't cooperate with each other, initially trivializing the threat. A sense of superiority means many of them don't believe that a handful of red barbarians could seriously threaten the empire. The first clashes quickly dispel these illusions. In November 1839, even before war is officially declared, a naval skirmish occurs at Chuanbi. The frigates Volage and Hyacinth demolished a squadron of 29 Chinese junks trying to block their way. The result is crushing. Chinese vessels are literally blown apart by British cannon fire, while the British don't lose a single ship. 10 of our 13 junks fell prey to the enemy. The flagship burned. Reports humiliated Admiral Guan Ti, who asks for a ceasefire right after the battle. When main expeditionary forces arrive in June 1840, the First Opium War proper begins. The British fleet first demonstrates its presence at the Pearl River mouth, blockading Canton. Then, according to orders from the London government, it sails north to threaten important ports and force concessions. In July that year, the squadron appears at the mouths of the Yangtze and Huangpu rivers, shelling coastal forts. You're completely shocked by such far-reaching operations. Ultimately, however, main battles concentrate back in the Pearl River Delta. In January 1841, the British attack key fortresses defending access to Canton, Chuanbai Fortress, and Taiwan Island. In this battle, the steamship Nemesis is used, which enters shallow waters and shells the Chinese at close range with Congreve rockets, causing panic. The same rockets also appeared in Poland. During the November uprising, General Josef Bem used them in the Battle of Olsinka Grochovska. The forts fall within an hour. According to estimates, over 500 Chinese soldiers die, while British losses amount to only a few dozen wounded. Nemesis becomes a terror. You christen it the iron-hulled dragon, capable of sailing against the current and sowing fire sideways. In subsequent months, a series of British victories continues with minimal own losses. In May 1841, expeditionary forces, reinforced by new Commander-in-Chief General Hugh Gough, attack Canton city. After brief fighting in the suburbs and capturing strategic hills above the city, Canton is occupied. Then, a peculiar event occurs. Upon news of the city's occupation, the local Qing commander, Prince Yishan, instead of fighting to the end, prefers to negotiate and pay ransom. For the price of $6 million in compensation, the so-called Canton ransom, the British agree to withdraw from the city and temporarily suspend operations. Yishan proclaims this as a diplomatic victory. In a report to the emperor, he even states that the barbarians fell on their knees, begging for mercy, promised to return debts and withdraw their ships, which of course is far from the truth. In reality, the British, though temporarily withdrawing to Hong Kong waters, remain untouched and ready for further offensive. You accompany Canton's defenders and describe scenes of chaos and falling morale. Chinese soldiers often lack the courage to face the redcoats. They flee, abandoning cannons. You see how entire units fall apart on news of approaching steam gunboats. Rumors and panic spread like wildfire. There's talk of British invulnerability to bullets, their magical powers, and fiery dragons. Rockets. Officials in Canton try to censor news to avoid causing panic among the population. But the truth whispered from mouth to mouth is crushing. Reports sent to Beijing present the situation in a falsified light. Prince Yishan doesn't inform the emperor about the actual military defeat, convincing the court he forced the British to withdraw. Thus, Emperor Daoguang remains for some time in the mistaken belief that the threat has been averted. However, the war is just gaining momentum and will soon reveal the full weakness of the porcelain empire in collision with the modern force of the West. The porcelain empire shatters. 1842 brings China's ultimate humiliation in this war. After the peace in Canton, the British under new command decide to strike into the country's interior to force the empire to capitulate. The war fleet heads north, occupying more important ports along the way. In July 1841, they captured Amoy. In September, Chusan fell at the Yangtze mouth, and in October, they occupied Ningbo. In each of these operations, Chinese defense collapses almost immediately. Qing officials flee before shots are even fired. For example, Shanghai's governor abandons the city on news of approaching foreign ships. Port cities open their gates without fighting or fall at minimal cost. At the beginning of the next year, the British, practically encountering no organized resistance, enter the waters of the Yangtze River, cutting the empire's main communication artery. The key moment becomes the battle for Zhenjiang on the Grand Canal in mid-year. A garrison of Manchu banners is stationed there, the empire's elite units. However, their morale was already broken earlier by a series of defeats. When Europeans begin bombardment and storm the walls, a desperate act occurs. Many Manchus, instead of surrendering, choose honorable death together with their families. Entire families of bannermen die in flames of homes they set fire to themselves or throw themselves into wells, not wanting to fall into enemy hands. Arriving in Zhenjiang just after the battle, you find a tragic picture. Notables, houses in ruins. Everywhere bodies of women and children, faithful wives and daughters of Manchu warriors who chose honorable death. The city is captured, and thus foreigners cut off Beijing from grain supplies flowing through the Grand Canal from the south. The specter of famine in the capital becomes real. Economic and administrative paralysis grips a large part of the country. In provinces affected by military operations, tax collection vanishes. Peasants abandon land, fleeing from fighting. Harvests are destroyed. Local coffers shine empty. Hunger and banditry appear in areas touched by chaos. In port cities, looting spreads. Local gangs, often the same ones that earlier earned from opium, exploit lawlessness for plunder. Along the Yangtze, armed pirate bands roam. Since the Imperial flotilla was destroyed or deprived of command, you observe how successive provincial offices are abandoned in panic. When news of approaching Red Devils reaches prefectures, governors burn documents, take families, and flee inland. Many administration buildings stand empty, and imperial seals lie abandoned on desks because there's no one left to seal with them. China, once a smoothly managed empire, now looks like a crumbling mosaic. You remain in the abandoned yamen of your city and still dutifully write reports about the situation, though you know there's no longer an addressee who would read them. With bitterness, you note, I sit in the office building, which is like a tomb. Emptiness in archives, emptiness in weapons magazines. The empire collapsed around me before I managed to understand when its pillars cracked. The war's culmination is Nanjing's capitulation. On August 29, 1842, after the British fleet stood at the gates of this former imperial city and threatened its bombardment, Qing authorities have no choice. The emperor's plenipotentiaries appear in Nanjing to beg for peace. The British dictate terms, and the Chinese side, humiliated and powerless, must accept them. The Treaty of Nanjing is signed, the first of a series of so-called unequal treaties. The treaty worse than defeat. The Treaty of Nanjing from 1842 proves for China a peace worse than military defeat. Under its provisions, the empire commits to paying enormous contribution, 21 million silver dollars in compensation to Great Britain. This sum includes recompense for destroyed opium, covering war costs, and repayment of old merchant debts, a horrendous amount for a treasury emptied after years of silver outflow. Additionally, China must cede Hong Kong Island to the British as colonial property. Symbolically, already in January 1841, the British planted their flag on rocky Hong Kong, and now the treaty sanctions this. A territorial jewel is lost. The biggest changes, however, occur in opening the country to foreigners. The treaty abolishes Canton's ancient monopoly, 5 ports. Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Fuzhou, and Ningbo are declared treaty ports, open to foreign trade. British merchants receive the right to settle there with families and conduct trade on terms described as fair and moderate. In practice, this means Qing will lose control over exchange conditions. External customs tariffs were set low and at a fixed level, convenient for the British. Moreover, in additional agreements, they were granted extraterritoriality rights, meaning jurisdictional exclusivity. Foreigners in treaty ports aren't subject to Chinese law, but to their own consuls and British courts. They were also assured a most favored nation clause, guaranteeing no other power receives better trade privileges than the British. Though formally the word opium doesn't appear in the treaty text, in practice its provisions mean legalization of this trade. The imperial ban becomes unenforceable. In open ports, foreigners can freely sell their goods at a low 5% tariff, and Chinese authorities no longer have the right to confiscate them or try them, you note with bitterness. The war was lost also on the moral field. The poison we pursued now flows in open streams, shielded by the British banner. Indeed, the Nanking Peace becomes the beginning of foreign powers' semi-colonial presence in China. Following the British, other countries quickly follow. In 1844, the United States and France force analogous treaties on Qing, multiplying privileges for foreigners. The Mandarin system, the empire's pride, lies in ruins along with the treaty. The traditional path of official career, through examinations and service, loses its former luster. The state treasury, to pay contributions and patch budget holes, begins increasingly often resorting to selling offices and titles for money. Many former scholars watch with horror as ministerial sinecures or military ranks are received by people without qualifications, as long as they're rich, who bought them out to gain status. Examinations admittedly still take place, but their significance is trampled by reality. China urgently needs funds to repay war debt and suppress rebellions. So, meritocratic selection gives way to corruption and protectionism. Moreover, the war exposed gaps in Confucian education itself. No classical quote protects against cannonballs. In the eyes of the young generation of Mandarins, conviction in Confucius's teaching's infallibility wavered. Even at the imperial court, questions appear. Isn't our knowledge too detached from reality? Many outstanding scholars begin calling for learning from Western barbarians, their technology and armament to strengthen the empire. This is the seed of the later self-strengthening movement. But you, raised in the old system, feel mainly bitterness. When as a lower-ranking official you receive for counter-signature an edict promulgating the Nanking Treaty's terms, your hand trembles. You know you're signing a document that crosses out your own career and ideals up to now. Every word of this decree was like a slap in the face to my life. You recall. You must affix your seal to an order opening ports and tolerating trade that just a year earlier you fought as a crime. The Treaty of Nanking formally ends the war, but in essence inaugurates an era of humiliations for China. The years between 1839 and 1949 are often described as the century of humiliation in Middle Kingdom history. You experience this as a personal defeat. You watch as foreigners settle in Shanghai and Canton, build factories not subject to local jurisdiction, as colonial gunboats patrol the Yangtze. The old world, where the Mandarin was master of the situation in his own country, ends. When defeat becomes epidemic. After the Opium War ends in 1842, China experiences what can be called history's greatest diplomatic irony. The loser must tolerate even more of what he fought against. The defeated empire is forced to accept an influx of more opium than ever before. Drug trade becomes not only legalized, but actually supported by international law. In subsequent years, opium imports grow to about 50,000 chests annually, and that's only officially. It's estimated that by the end of the 19th century, about 10% of the entire population, or nearly 40 million people, live in opium's smoky dreams. This means that, in an average village, every 10th person spends more time in a den than at home. Imagine a society where 1 in 10 residents regularly escapes into opium fantasies, and the rest must pay for it. In wealthy elite salons, a true opium culture emerges, refined to the limits of absurdity. This is no longer taking drugs. It becomes an art of living. Rich Mandarins organize lavish opium sessions like today's collectors hold wine tastings. They have special rooms, elegant lamps, intricately crafted pipes from bamboo and metal. Entire arsenals of narcotic elegance. Smoking occurs according to strict ceremony. Each session has its ritual. Individual people exchange pipes, maintain vessel cleanliness, carefully measure doses. Opium was mixed with various additives, sometimes tobacco, sometimes herbs. Some connoisseurs could distinguish opium quality like a sommelier does wine vintages. In the most luxurious salons, an atmosphere of decadence worthy of Roman orgies prevails. In dim lamplight, smokers lie on silk cushions, listening to poetry recitations, playing string instruments. Add to this courtesans, educated women who not only accompany wealthy clients, but also know about opium themselves. A Chinese chronicler describes one of them. Lin was an artist of her craft. She painted herself daily when expecting a client, demanded 1 liang of silver. She led men to the inner room where prepared lamps and trays waited. She took a Hunan speckled bamboo pipe, lay down with the client, sharing the pillow by the lamp. She scooped opium paste, lit the flame, and lived from this business. For the rich, smoking opium becomes a way to kill boredom and emphasize status, a luxury that killed boredom and provided pleasure to the privileged. But opium is a democratic drug. It destroys rich and poor with equal ruthlessness, only in different styles. The poor buy lower quality mixtures, often counterfeit, so-called quan, where opium was drowned in cheaper substances. For peasants and laborers, smoking isn't elegant entertainment, but sad necessity. Brief illusion of relief after a hard day's work. Coolies, physical workers, stevedores, have their dens by ports. These are squalid dives, where instead of silk cushions are straw mats, and instead of silver lamps, ordinary clay lamps. Workers come here during work breaks to seemingly strengthen themselves for a moment. What's tragic is that for many poor, opium really works as medicine. It soothes back pain after 12 hours of hauling, fatigue after a full day's work in fields, despair from poverty. But this is treating symptoms that worsens the disease. In the poorest districts, men lose the ability for hard work. Wives must take over their duties or, worse, find other ways of earning. For many Chinese women, opium became a way to survive. They used it to support their families. But it's a vicious circle. Women sold services related to opium to support addicted fathers and husbands. Most tragic is what happens to the young generation. The new generation entering adulthood after the war often seeks easy escape in opium smoke instead of traditional education. Young students, seeing the fall of imperial examinations' prestige and parents' poverty, fall into apathy or addictions. With sadness, you note, the young, instead of delving into books, delve into opium pipes. Here's the harvest of our defeat. Among the young, especially students from upper urban classes, opium smoking becomes fashionable. One chronicler writes about young people dreaming of temporary elevation. A young smoker in trance compares himself to a demigod, a striking contrast between momentary pleasure and subsequent fall. Students organize smoking sessions like today's parties, except after an opium party, you don't wake with a hangover, but with addiction. In some schools, more students know about opium quality than classical literature. Opium acts on families like acid. It destroys all bonds from within. One family member's addiction overturns the entire social structure. Men who were supposed to be breadwinners lie in opium trances. Women must take over their duties or save the situation in even worse ways. The cruelest aspect of the opium epidemic is exploiting children. American missionaries record cases where 7-year-old girls were forced into prostitution to finance father's opium. In some regions, selling daughters became so common that an entire market developed. Parents addicted to opium sold children to wealthier homes, to plantations, and in the worst case, to pleasure houses. Entire families fell into a spiral of destruction. Mothers, trying to support families, themselves reached for opium, to drown despair, to forget problems. Children grew up in an atmosphere of smoke, where it was normal for parents to spend more time in dens than with family. The epidemic's effects in the army were tragic and dangerous for the state. Soldiers who were supposed to defend the empire first searched for opium in the morning before battle. Reports speak of troops that proved so deeply addicted to opium they had no strength to fight. Imagine the scene. The enemy attacks, and Chinese soldiers lie drowsy in opium trances. Officers try to wake them for battle, but addicted warriors can barely hold weapons. This was a zombie army, alive but incapable of action. Desertions became a plague. Soldiers abandoned posts to go to the city seeking opium. Some stole weapons and sold them to get money for the drug. Still others became smugglers. After all, they knew the best routes and had access to weapons for protecting cargo. The smoking process itself developed into a refined art with its own rituals and traditions. Chinese describe smoking symbolically as swallowing cloud and exhaling fog, a poetic term for prosaic addiction. Smoking implements became cult objects. Ornate oil lamps, intricately decorated pipes from bamboo, silver, and metal, special boxes for opium paste, all this testified to the owner's status. Some pipes were true works of art, with carved scenes from mythology, inlays of ivory or jade. Each den had its ceremony. Smokers sat or lay on cushions around a central lamp. They exchanged pipes according to determined order. You couldn't light the next dose until everyone finished the previous one. They maintained vessel cleanliness, opium quality, proper smoke temperature. In elegant salons, an entire vocabulary developed related to opium. It was called Dayan, big smoke. But dozens of terms existed for different varieties and smoking methods. They spoke of dragon sleep, journey to clouds, dance with gods. This was poeticization of degradation, beautiful words for ugly reality. At the local economy level, opium acted like a financial black hole, sucking everything into its reach. Enormous amounts of silver flowed from peasants, craftsmen, and merchants' pockets, causing local financial crises. In some regions, entire villages went into debt to opium dealers. The mechanism was simple and merciless. A villager started with occasional smoking, gradually increased doses, finally spent more on opium than he earned. He went into debt with the local dealer, mortgaged land, tools, household goods. Finally sold the house and moved to the city seeking work, which often ended as another way to get money for opium. Entire regions changed economic character. Villages that earlier lived from agriculture now lived from opium. Some sold it, others bought it. Still others were addicted to it. A whole service business developed around the drug. Dens, smuggling, accessory production, and even treatment of addiction. Contemporary Chinese medicine had no tools for treating addiction. Moreover, opium itself was used as a painkiller, so doctors found themselves in a no-win situation. The patient suffered from addiction, but the only known painkiller was opium. Folk treatment methods developed, mostly equally harmful as the drug itself. Various mixtures, herbs, and even other psychoactive substances were used. Some healers proposed replacing opium with alcohol, which was like treating one addiction with another. Addiction had characteristic symptoms everyone recognized on the street. Emaciated bodies, yellowish complexion, trembling hands, drowsiness. Addicted people walked like shadows, physically present but mentally elsewhere. After withdrawal, they suffered severe abstinence symptoms: tremors, nausea, fever, insomnia. Opium caused a real earthquake in Chinese morality. A society based on Confucian values, respect for elders, duty to family, service to state, suddenly found itself in a situation where these values turned upside down. Sons, instead of caring for parents, robbed them to buy opium. Fathers, instead of supporting families, squandered money in dens. Officials, instead of serving the state, served their own addiction. This was degradation of the entire social structure. A certain chronicler called opium simultaneously luxury and aphrodisiac, source of livelihood and painkiller, but ended with bitter observation that its spread acted as killer of Chinese society. This was an apt description. Opium was killing China from within, slowly but systematically. Along with opium's spread, crime increased. Addicts who had already spent everything on the drug resorted to theft and robbery. Organized crime developed around trade. Gangs controlled smuggling routes, dens, and warehouses. Regular wars occurred between criminal groups over the most profitable territories. Port city streets became dangerous, especially at night. Local authorities were often corrupt. They accepted bribes from dealers, turned a blind eye to smuggling, and sometimes even cooperated with gangs. Women's situation during the epidemic was particularly tragic. On one hand, they became main victims. They had to take over addicted husbands' duties. On the other, some found in opium a way to survive. Courtesans in elegant salons earned more from opium than traditional services. They were guides through the drug world, knew about quality, could prepare smoking sessions. Some made careers as opium experts. At the lowest social level, women suffered most. Wives were beaten by addicted husbands, daughters sold for opium, mothers had to watch their own children's degradation. In some families, women themselves reached for opium, to drown pain, to escape reality. As a result of the epidemic, local communities began falling apart. Traditional bonds, neighborhood, family, guild, couldn't withstand addiction's pressure. People were interested only in obtaining and consuming opium. Everything else lost meaning. Villages emptied, healthy members left for cities, and addicted elderly and families immersed in addiction remained in homes. Fields lay fallow, workshops closed. Entire districts of opium zombies emerged, people alive but incapable of normal life. The most symbolic image of degradation is the former prefecture building in Canton. In examination halls where Confucian classics once resounded, now rows of addicts lie on bunks, immersed in intoxication. Where Confucius's recitations once resounded, today a sweetish odor of smoke rises, you note with bitterness. This was a metaphor for the entire value system's collapse. Ideals replaced by addiction, virtue by addiction, wisdom by delusions. Most ironic in this story was that Lin Zexu, the hero of resistance against opium, was after the war exiled to the empire's edges as co-guilty of provoking conflict. His fate became a symbol for all mandarins. You pay for zeal and patriotism with downfall when the empire loses. Many officials fell into cynicism or apathy. Some, irony of fate, themselves reached for opium as a way to cope with defeat and disappointment. You stand before the former ministry building, in whose niches dealers and smokers now sit. You recall times when you believed in China's indestructibility. Under Karnik, we thought we were immortal, that the empire lasts forever, like heaven. The Opium War brutally showed this was an illusion. The Chinese empire proved fragile as porcelain, beautiful outside, but easily cracking at the first blow of modern force. We were porcelain, fragile and helpless, though we boasted the title of Sons of Heaven. Opium smoke still rises over the empire. But it's no longer just a symbol of addiction. It's a symbol of an entire world's fall that seemed eternal. The epidemic that devoured the nation left behind ruins not only health or economic, but above all moral and cultural. What remained after this epidemic? Besides millions of destroyed human existences, faith in Chinese civilization was destroyed. A society that for millennia considered itself the world's most perfect suddenly discovered it was defenseless against a simple drug sold by barbarians. This was more than military or economic defeat. This was civilizational defeat. Proof that old ways of thinking, old institutions, and old values couldn't cope with new challenges. Opium became a catalyst for changes that were inevitable anyway, but it accelerated them and made them more painful. This story's end isn't history's end. It's just the beginning of China's long road to modernity. But this road began with opium smoke that obscured the sky over the Middle Kingdom and changed it forever. History doesn't end with the Nanking Treaty. The Second Opium War will become a concert of four powers that together forced China into submission. The United States, Russia, and France, acting under Great Britain's leadership, will lead to the Peking Convention, depriving the Middle Kingdom of economic autonomy. It's precisely from the First Opium War that what the Chinese will later call the Century of Humiliation begins. Then for the first time, an empire that considered itself the world's center had to kneel before foreign force. Scars from that time are visible to this day, because contemporary China still carries within itself memory of that fall. Opium remained not only a symbol of national tragedy, but also a warning and reminder of how bitter relations with the world can be when pride collides with reality. Empire in smoke's fog. This phrase isn't an exaggeration. Opium smoke covered China in fog in which former might crumbled to dust, and on its ruins, a new, uncertain world emerged. A world in which the Middle Kingdom had to redefine its place between tradition and modernity, between pride and painful reality. And if this journey through history's fog pleased you even a little, leave a trace. A comment, like, or subscription will ensure the algorithm doesn't fall asleep as quickly as a mandarin in an opium den. Thanks to this, more people will find this story, and we'll be able to meet in the next episode.